I will never forget the day I met Officer Hanks. I had seen other humans before, in dark corners and bars around the port, but never had I seen one like him. All of the humans here were battle-scarred leathery apes that gravitated towards strong brews and smoking herbs. They gambled in the streets, a ludicrous wasteful practice that quickly spread throughout the spaceports they visited. And they skulked in the shadows of brothels, waiting to spend their pay on erotic fantasies with foreign species, despite the high risk of inflammatory void warts. But Hanks stood out like a Fars module in a Clitorians. Heh. Sorry, I'm not used to formal occasions. Anyway, Hanks was the strangest human I'd ever seen. His eyes were still bright, not dulled by years of void radiation and weathered by 100 battles. His skin was smooth, untouched by the filth of foreign planets. He had a large shock of black hair curling forth from his scalp. As for his face, he looked, well, I'd never seen a human child at that point, but now I can definitely say it was boyish. He smiled as broad as a solar crowning on Terra 4. He was as fresh off Earth as a skin husk on cycle day. So, here I was, combing one of the biggest spaceports on Sophiso 7 for a single human recruit. No uniform, no tracer, nothing to go on, but he's a human. His name's Hankus. You'll know him when you see him. Well, I'll tell you what. I took one look at this guy and I thought, that's no human. Well, he must have gotten better instruction than I did. Because he took one look at me and commenced to act in possibly the stupidest manner I've ever seen a human act. His eyes light up and he starts waving one of his long appendages about, like he's performing some bizarre rating ritual in the middle of the street. He stumbles toward me with clumsy steps and flashes his enormous white teeth at me, yelling, Hey there. Officer Tarsus. Officer Tarsus. I swear, in that moment, I felt every CDI in a mile on my flesh coat, wondering if it was worth the risk to recycle me right then and there. Clearly nobody had bothered to inform Recruit Hanks that the Pan-Galactic Navy wasn't exactly the Gorn beast of the banquet in these systems. But he was so eager to please, so enthusiastic in his idiotic stumbling, that I couldn't help but feel somewhat endeared to him as I motioned him over and signed his final transcripts. We picked up his baggage, among which he had a large bladder of some kind, packed among a series of hollow, but finely crafted wooden rods that completely baffled me at the time. And finally returned to the safety of the local fleet headquarters, where he proceeded to talk until I was sure his mouth would warp off planet of its own accord. He tells me he was descended from a great hero. I doubted it. A hero that the people of Earth still remember for his remarkable accomplishments. Running across a continent, surviving for years on a desolate island, befriending a canine, and solving crimes with it. At this point, I realized humans must be completely full of bull-scar to believe such tales. And finally dying, after destroying an armored vehicle in combat with only a small projectile sidearm. He told me all this and more, and he joked. I had never heard so many jokes in my life. Most of them I did not understand at the time, but he didn't seem to mind at all. I remember as I explained the incredible suction that is generated in the subsurface sand pits of Sophiso 7. He whistles and says, the pits are all fine and well, but I'd like to see what her mouth can do before I commit to anything. I still laugh when I think of it today. I must admit, I did not think he would fare well in the fleet. This was a place for grim soldiers and staunch stomachs. At the time I was sure he would fade into another husk of Ascension after a battle or two, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. His jokes and his stories and his ridiculous claims to legendary status were the best amusement the men had seen in decades. He lit up the mess halls with his face, and he never once forgot a name. He even taught us all to play basketball. Which I still do not claim to understand, but he was so adamant in its instruction that we all played to humor him. He brought light to the darkness that had so long held us in that lonely vessel among the stars. He was never a great soldier, he never fired unless fired upon first, and I don't think I ever once saw him hit his mark. But he had no small measure of bravery. When we were surrounded by Crockle mercenaries, it was he that suggested talking terms with the ruthless and notoriously unforgiving reptilians. When we were captured by rebels on Jacker, it was Corporal Hanks that planned our escape, using a couple of maintenance uniforms for disguises and a large rubber phallus as a weapon. Aha, oh, that was an adventure. Of course, this brings me to the last day I saw Officer Hanks. A day which I shall also never forget. The Battle of Kirkuin, PTC date July 10, 4087 AD. The Third Bolin Empire had been steadily advancing on Confederation borders. Plans for a Bolin tactical strike on the colony planet Kirk had been discovered. The planet was peaceful, the inhabitants were a handful of natives and approximately 3 million Navy Reserve families and associated traders. The garrison at full strength was only 500,000, and most were unarmed, as the station had not seen action since its founding, and primarily served as a relay for information across ITC borders. The only ship near enough to intercept the attack was a single frigate, manned by a crew of 200 souls, the Judge Victorious. The ship arrived to find a colony in ruins. Though the Judge's orders were to engage and halt the attack, it was woefully outnumbered, nearly 20 to 1. I, as commanding officer, gave the order to transport a quarter of the ship's fighting force to defend the outpost that still stood among the rubble, making the evacuation of civilians their highest priority. Officer Hanks was the first to volunteer. As CO, I felt an obligation to lead this mission, leaving explicit orders that, should we fail, the Judge were to glass the planet to save the captive survivors from punishment unimaginable and retreat to Confederate space. There could be no failure if any were to survive. Our craft landed, and our techs immediately began to assemble teleportation apparatus within the outpost walls, while crewmen began to assist the colonists. There were over 500 to be evacuated under heavy fire. On the third attempt to leave the colony, with only 350 souls left to be evacuated, the transports were shot down, and the inhabitants presumed dead on impact. We held the walls with all our strength for 2 hours, and lost almost half of our force doing so. With only 33 crewmen left, the teleport had been assembled and was charged for a single transport of 200. We put the children too young to fight on board. The elderly refused to go. With a single charge and the front gates buckling under the weight of 1,000 Bolani warriors, they were sent up to the waiting Judge Victorious, which unfortunately drew attention to the ship. Under heavy fire, I relinquished command to First Mate Toril, with the orders to forego the merciful atomic salvo, and instead save the munitions to cover their escape. 4 Bolin ships fell, and the Judge retreated safely. It was at this point that I noticed Officer Hanks, my dearest comrade, stripping his uniform. "Hanks," I called. "Hanks, what in the heavens are you doing?" He laughs and says, "We have a saying on Earth. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get." I was completely without words. Here we were, preparing to kill ourselves, to save ourselves from a torturous end, and he was stripping and painting his chest. "Hanks, I hope you have a plan. Because I don't see a way out of here, and you seem to know something I don't." He looked at me, and he looked at the colonists, and he said just this: "Out the back." Then he picks up his bizarre bag, this sack of wooden pipes he had carried with him for over 10 years, that I had never bothered to guess its purpose, and he begins to assemble them into what appeared to be a primitive instrument, and tucked it under his arm. "Go," he yelled. "Go. Now." That was the last time I saw him. It was, as I herded the remaining natives and elderly with Private Blakely and Private Stirs, who were both fresh recruits and were reasoned to be the best with civilian matters, that I heard a sound I had never heard before in my life, a low buzzing. It was this sound that echoed about the glen surrounding the outpost, carrying for miles and miles. It must have been as loud as a caravel engine at takeoff. Such a sound I have never heard in my life, and then it began to play a tune. I cannot describe to you here today what human pipes can do to a soldier's heart, but all I can say of is that it feels as though your very being is being lifted and your very soul has been taken to another place, a place I have never been, but can see as clearly as day. A place of green fields and warm light and wild flowers. As I heard that sweet tune thrum out over the hills, I somehow knew that this was a song that most will only hear at their death. Ernest Hanks died on July 11, 4087, in the early hours of the morning, with the dawn. Outnumbered nearly 100 to 1, he led a small force of 30 pan-galactic sailors in a last-minute charge to save the lives of the civilians fleeing the colony of Kirkune. Accounts by survivors on both sides claim the following. Sometime, just before dawn, a fire was lit in the outpost, setting the entire complex ablaze and cutting off any hopes of retreat for the valiant crew. It was at this point that the Bolin forces broke through the main gate to the complex to find a wall of las guns pointed at the bottleneck that was the gate. After firing 6 salvos and felling an estimated 120 elite Bolin raiders, the crew, now devoid of ammunition, charged with improvised weaponry, which mainly consisted of sharpened stakes, kitchen knives, and righteous fury. Leading the charge was one officer, Ernest Hanks. He was armed only with a set of Scottish pipes. The Bolani, being unaccustomed to the excruciatingly loud music and being visually impaired by the light of the rising star, quailed like sheep before the slaughter under the initial assault, as one sergeant claimed. The small crew fought fiercely against the insurmountable odds, and one time enough for the innocent civilian occupants to escape to the nearest outpost, while reinforcements warped in from neighboring systems. In the end, Officer Hanks was shot through the stomach and chest 5 times over before succumbing to his wounds. He did not stop playing until his lungs were scorched and he breathed his last. His valiant leadership and steadfast courage saved the lives of 12 remaining crewmen and over 150 civilians. He was a great man and my greatest friend. Elias Tarsus, captain of the Judge Victorious of the Pan-Galactic Trade Confederation Navy. Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.